From the Gulf States newsroom, this is the Gulf States Gumbo, your weekly serving of stories from Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. I'm community engagement reporter Elise Gregg, chopping it up this week. So we're doing something a little different this week. We're handing the show over to our partners at WWNO in New Orleans and WRKF in Baton Rouge to talk about climate change. Last month, a headline from The Guardian made waves online, especially in New Orleans, and if you live in the Crescent City, you already know exactly which one I'm talking about. It's titled Point of No Return. That part is in quotation marks. New Orleans relocation must start now due to sea level rise, study finds. It sounds pretty dire, but there's more to it than that. Reporters Aubri, Juhasz, and Tesfaye have looked over the study, the national media coverage of it, and how locals are responding. And even if you don't live in New Orleans or Louisiana, their conversation with one another is still worth a listen. Because the big question, whether to adapt or relocate, is one our whole region is facing.
Hi, Aubri.
Hey, Eva.
So, Aubri, I want to start by asking you, what was your initial response to this paper that was published in Nature's Sustainability Journal and the backlash it kicked off? We're reporters, but we also live in New Orleans, so I wanted to know how you learned about it and what was your reaction?
Well, since I'm not an environmental reporter like you, I learned about it the way most people did, and that was through national media coverage. While there was some local reporting, the study wasn't really treated as big news, at least when it first came out. And the way national outlets were talking about New Orleans' future, that the city may not be savable because of land loss and sea level rise, it really got me riled up. I was working from home and I started shouting across the house to my partner. And he's from here. His family goes many generations back. And he basically was like, calm down. I've been hearing this my entire life. It's not a big deal.
Yeah, I mean, similarly, I was just kind of like, this again.
Yeah. But, I think that speaks to the dynamic that the city has with the rest of the country to some extent. And, since Hurricane Katrina, people who live here have had to listen to people who largely don't live here, asking whether their home should continue to exist, a question that we both know is, incredibly hurtful to ask someone. And there's plenty of examples of poorer communities that have had their homes sacrificed to save wealthier areas from flooding and other environmental issues. So it's pretty loaded. It's a charged space, and it doesn't provide the best starting place to have a calm conversation about the very real challenges that New Orleans is facing.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's why there's been so much pushback to the media coverage and, in some cases, the study itself, which was authored by researchers who have all lived in New Orleans at least at some point.
Yeah. What kind of pushback did you see, when this first came out?
Well, I saw a lot of it from, regular people on social media, a lot of it from local environmental groups that are doing adaptation. Some of it was from public officials. So the chairman of Louisiana's Coastal Restoration and Protection Authority, Gordon Dove, called it the most ridiculous study he has ever seen, saying that the New Orleans levee system will protect it from sea level rise. I should note, under Landry, Dove canceled two of the state's biggest coastal projects to rebuild land, which the authors of the study criticized, saying that that basically meant the state was giving up on New Orleans and other parts of southern Louisiana. Then there was also New Orleans Mayor Helena Moreno. She published an op-ed in the local paper saying the study, quote, treats uncertainty as inevitability, and she argued New Orleans has always adapted and innovated to survive, and it will continue to do so.
Something I've been interested in is how much people are responding to media coverage of the study versus the study itself. The paper is behind a paywall, which is unfortunate because that means people can't easily access it. I only got to read it after you sent me a media link to it. But I think, a lot of people have only had the news coverage to go off of. I spoke to one of the paper's authors, Torbjorn Tornquist. He's a geology professor at Tulane and lives in New Orleans. And he told me he wanted the paper to be available publicly, but ran into issues with the publisher. He says a number of news stories, in his opinion, sensationalize their findings. And he recently published an op-ed to try to set the record straight. While he says he didn't anticipate the level of backlash he's been dealing with,
what I'm very pleased with is we have gotten the conversation started, and that was the main goal I had. We have to start talking about this. This issue has basically been taboo, and we just can't have that anymore.
He wants people to talk about the research itself. So let's talk about it, Eva. You've given it a really close look. What does the paper actually say?
Yeah, so first, I think it's really important to understand what kind of a scientific paper this is. It's called a perspectives paper. The goal of these is not to present new information, but to synthesize the information we already have into a scientifically informed opinion, usually with the goal of sparking debate.
Okay, so exactly what he told me.
Right. The paper uses geology to show that basically everything south of Baton Rouge was underwater at one point in Earth's history and will likely be underwater again. So it uses two projections, 3 meters of sea level rise and 7 meters. The paper doesn't predict exactly when these areas will be underwater, but it suggests that it's inevitable. So it argues that we should start planning to relocate people now for a bunch of different reasons. One is that relocation takes a really long time. This paper cites the relocation of a town in Sweden that's planned to take place over 30 years. Another relocation of a native village in Alaska called Newtok, that took about 20 to 30 years as well.
So a whole generation.
Yeah. There's that. Like, we should start planning now because it's going to take a long time anyway. But another reason is to avoid climate gentrification. This is when people are priced out of an area due to climate change. So in Louisiana, that looks like maybe not being able to rebuild after a hurricane or not affording high insurance costs, those kinds of things.
Right. And when wealthier people can afford those things, they're able to stay. And in some cases, they might even move in and displace other people.
Exactly. And the third reason is to avoid people relocating to other vulnerable places or in ways that would further harm the environment. So basically, these scientists are saying people are already leaving South Louisiana. Let's start thinking about how to do this systematically and equitably. The other thing to note is that the paper makes a point of saying we still need to be focused on adaptation, including trying to build back coastal land through things like sediment diversion projects. But they mainly argue for adaptation in the case of buying more time for relocation.
Yeah, and I think this is the argument that I've found people that have read the paper and are critical of it are most likely to disagree with. While the researchers say they're being pragmatic, the people I've spoken to who work for environmental groups that focus on strengthening Louisiana so people can continue to live here, they feel like what you were just describing is defeatist. Here's Francisca Troutman with Glass Half Full, an organization that recycles glass and uses the sand they produce to rebuild the coast.
I think relocation feels like a cop-out, for lack of better words. I don't think anywhere is going to be safe from climate change. And I think if we say, oh, but we could just move, then it's almost like kicking the can down the road.
She gave the example of Asheville, North Carolina, which is pretty far inland but was still devastated by Hurricane Helene. Troutman says she also felt like the paper glossed over how painful it would be to uproot New Orleanians from their home. I asked Tornquist more about this, and he told me he doesn't feel like the paper is insensitive, but forcing a necessary conversation. And if we don't prepare to relocate, like you were saying, with inequity, vulnerable people will be hurt the most and left behind.
It's just a very, very different way of thinking about stuff than what we're used to. But I strongly believe that we can.
The evidence he cites for this is the documented movements of indigenous people in this part of the country before the area was colonized. I know you were really interested in this part of the paper, Eva. What does it say?
Yes. So before Europeans settled in this area, New Orleans was actually known as Bolbancha, and the indigenous people would move as the river changed and flooded, either to other drier places or up onto mounds that they built. So when I saw this study reference that history, I knew I wanted to talk to Devin Parfait. He's the chief of the Grand Cayuga tribe and a coastal scientist. And he said, yes, there was a time when indigenous people could move more freely as an adaptation method, but that was before settlers came and established private property. So the fact that we're now attached to these homes that we rent or buy makes migration a lot harder. It makes evacuation a lot more of a complicated choice. And on top of that, relocation also has this darker connotation for many indigenous people.
A lot of our communities were forcibly moved and displaced during the times of colonization to make way for development and industry.
So Parfait says the Grand Cayuga tribe has made a conscious decision to adapt in place despite all the land loss they're experiencing. Like you mentioned, he said they had tribal members who moved to North Carolina and then were impacted by Hurricane Helene.
So they've seen firsthand that moving doesn't always guarantee security.
Exactly.
We have a recent example of government-led relocation in Louisiana. What does Parfait think of the effort to move people from Ile-de-Jean-Charles?
Yeah, so let me explain what happened there. So this was a Native community in Terrebonne Parish that was relocated due to climate change and land loss. But the residents are really not happy with how that relocation went. In fact, the John Charles Choctaw Nation has filed an official complaint with the federal government against the state of Louisiana over it. They say that the state resettled them in these shoddy homes in an area where there's still flooding and pushed the tribe out of the decision-making for its own relocation. Here's Parfait again.
Entire communities can be devastated by not making sure that you do it the right way.
So I think if you're familiar with the story of Ile-de-Jean-Charles, it's fair to question who would be responsible for managing a relocation of New Orleans, and would they be able to do it well? So when you spoke to Turnquist, did he talk about why they didn't mention Ile-de-Jean-Charles in the paper?
Yeah, he told me he thought about it, but the paper honestly was already too long. And he felt like the relocation had gotten a lot of coverage already at that point, which he's also not wrong about.
Yes.
But he acknowledged, the problems with it. He said it's important that people in government and other people who could be leading relocations learn from it and do better. Because, in his opinion, he thinks that there's going to be many more situations like that where relocations of even larger communities are going to be necessary.
And we are already seeing that around the country. There are tribes in Alaska that are also relocating. The Chitimacha tribe here in Louisiana has some money for relocation. So, yeah, this is something that other communities will have to contend with as well.
Do you think the distinction, though, with that is like whether or not it's community-led?
That is totally right. And I think that is also what defines when a relocation goes well or not. Like I said, the Ile-de-Jean-Charles tribes feels like their relocation was no longer community-led when it was taken over by the state. So, Aubri, one of the ways that people in New Orleans reacted to the paper and this doomsday-level media coverage was, of course, to throw a dance party. Yeah. That's very New Orleans. You went. How was it?
Yeah, it was definitely an energizing space for folks, a place for people to dance out their angst, but also to organize. It was at Hotel Peter and Paul in the Marigny, and a bunch of environmental groups had set up tables so they could educate people and get them involved in their work. The event was co-sponsored by Troutman's organization Glass Half Full and the Water Collaborative, which promotes equitable and sustainable solutions to living with water. So 2 groups focused on adaptation. Jessica Dandridge-Smith is the group's executive director. I asked her how she hoped people would feel after attending the event.
I hope that people will leave feeling hopeful and joyful. That's the key, is that we're missing joy today.
There was definitely joy on the dance floor, and it spilled out into the street at the end of the night. And Dandridge-Smith told me she hopes that joy helps sustain people who are fighting to protect Louisiana to preserve it for future generations.
Aubri, thanks for talking with me about this.
Yeah, thank you to you. I'm really glad we did this.
This week's show is cooked up by the Gulf States Newsroom team. Our theme music is by DJ Supreme. Special thanks to our partner stations WBHM, Mississippi Public Broadcasting, WWNO, and WRKF. You can find us in your podcast feeds every Friday. Look us up and be sure to subscribe. Again, I'm your host, Elise Gregg. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to stir your brew.